If you've ever watched the Pokemon anime at all, you've seen Hyper Beam used and are thus familiar with the way it is portrayed as the ultimate attack. Its awe-inspiring power, coupled with its breathtakingly exciting animation, inspired many a budding young trainer, including us. How could you not be wowed when it was launched? Perhaps the most memorable example, however, comes not from a showcase of its strength, but from the expectation of how monstrous it is against just about anything. In the first Pokemon movie, we first come to understand Mewtwo as nigh invulnerable when it effortlessly deflects a Hyper Beam from Gyarados. Everyone else stares in disbelief, and it is precisely this disbelief that enhances our understanding of Mewtwo. Hyper Beam is the ultimate attack after all, as taking a grand total of 0% without even being a ghost type put it at the top. Now, anime Hyper Beam is quite a different beast from the in-game Hyper Beam. The latter forces a turn of recharge from its user where they cannot switch out at all. And maybe that's fine when you're blasting your way through the Elite Four and can make up for these lost turns by spamming revives and full restores, but no such luxuries exist in competitive Pokemon. And every turn is crucial in competitive Pokemon. Thus, this hindrance is too crippling to make Hyper Beam's immense power worth it. It is far too exploitable for the opponent. One of the first things new competitive players learn when starting out is that Hyper Beam, as cool as it is not a move you want on your team. It's one of the foremost general rules of competitive Pokemon, and it perfectly encapsulates the fundamental concept that power isn't everything. Or as we refer to it here on False White Gaming, the Rampardos theorem. However, general rules are broken by top-tier competitive players all the time, who find creative ways to gain advantages by eschewing previous conventional wisdom. Did this also apply to Hyper Beam? Plus, Hyper Beam's mechanics used to be a little different before it became the most nerfed move in Pokemon history. And today we're looking at the competitive history of everyone's first favorite attack, Hyper Beam. In the initial generation of competitive Pokemon, Hyper Beam was actually one of the most common moves. Why, you ask? It had the recharging effect, just like every other generation. Was giving up a free turn not such a big deal? Were move pools simply that barren? No, neither of those things were true. Giving the opponent free turns was one of the absolute last things you wanted to do in RBY, since that meant you would be staring down attacks from the likes of Tauros, one of the most dangerous Hyper Beam users. But let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. Move pools weren't as seemingly endless as modern generations, but they were far from barren either. Tauros always used Hyper Beam at the cost of other moves it might like to run, while conversely the strongest Hyper Beam user in the game, Snorlax, often wasn't even able to fit it into its moveset. Several other Hyper Beam users didn't exactly require it either. Before we move on, we'll clarify something you might be thinking. Wait, Tauros and Snorlax are physical attackers. Why are they using Hyper Beam? The answer, for those unfamiliar, is that in the first 3 generations, a move's status as physical or special was dependent on its type. This meant all normal type moves, be they Body Slam or Hyper Beam, were physical. Feel free to consult our Gen 1 battling video for more information. Anyway, the reason Hyper Beam was such a prominent force in the first generation was because of one game-changing mechanic not present in any other generation. If Hyper Beam KO'd an opposing Pokemon, the Hyper Beam user would not need to recharge. This made Hyper Beam the ultimate high-risk, high-reward move. It could thud into a healthy Pokemon and give the opponent a ruinous free turn, or it could grab KOs from high ranges in no ways no other move could. This extra burst of damage was part of what made Tauros so incredibly dangerous. Switching into its Body Slam was irritating, but switching into its Body Slam and still being healthy enough to take the subsequent Hyper Beam was something else entirely. This was exacerbated by pretty much everything switching into Tauros being slower than it, so you couldn't exactly switch into its Body Slam and threaten to retaliate somehow before it could threaten Hyper Beam, with the exception of Starmie, which was both faster and could take hits well, but it was, of course, at risk of Body Slam paralysis. As a result, part of playing around Tauros consisted of switching around, trying to draw an errant Hyper Beam that could be punished. But switching around Tauros could also be punished by smart players who were patient enough to not predictably pull the highly tempting Hyper Beam trigger, instead spreading damage and potentially paralysis all over the place. This was especially dangerous since, thanks to RBY's mechanics, Tauros' high speed meant it had a high critical hit rate of 21%. Speaking of which, there was little more devastating in RBY than a critical hit Hyper Beam. You could predict the beam perfectly and switch to a Pokemon healthy enough to absorb it, but Tauros could very well just crit it, and your efforts would be for naught. This was why the most famous RBY saying is, when there's a Tauros, there's a way. You couldn't exactly load up on normal resists either. Not only were they rare in RBY, but the few resists that did exist, Gengar and the rock ground types, Rhydon and Golem, weren't exactly safe against Tauros' coverage moves. This made the 1-2 punch of Body Slam and Hyper Beam incredibly threatening. Body Slam was spammable, and Hyper Beam was always lurking right behind, threatening to deliver the coup de grace. Snorlax didn't possess Tauros' speed and therefore didn't possess its crit rate. In fact, its crit rate was lower than the universal 6.25% chance of generations 2 through 6. Of course, Body Slam's paralysis rate could help compensate for Lax's lower speed, but since normal types couldn't be paralyzed by Body Slam, Snorlax's switch-ins often tended to be Chansey and opposing Snorlax, and it couldn't threaten the effect when fighting opposing Tauros either. Still a great weapon, but not even one it needed to make the most of Hyper Beam. Snorlax made up for these deficiencies with its sheer power, packing the strongest unboosted Hyper Beam in the game. Thanks to the maxed out EVs of the first generation, everything was quite bulky, and Hyper Beam's huge power was one of the few ways to blast through. It was a big deal when Lax could threaten damage thresholds of 43 to 50% to opposing Lax, 48 to 57 to Exeggutor, roughly 50 to 59% to the dangerous late game threats Zapdos and Tauros, or a whopping 67 to 78 on Chansey. Another factor that made Snorlax's Hyper Beam particularly dangerous was that unlike Tauros, you didn't know if it was carrying the move or not. Of course, you would respect the move's possibility and scout for it early on. You wouldn't just leave your Chansey out to dry, as assuming the Lax with an unrevealed moveset wouldn't be running Hyper Beam. However, smart Snorlax players were often able to hide Hyper Beam and could thus unleash it most effectively late in the game. The unseen Hyper Beam is the deadliest, as not revealing its fourth move slot wasn't exactly indicative of Hyper Beam either. It could be a number of other things. Hyper Beam wasn't just limited to stab users either. One particularly prominent metagame development came when Exeggutor began running the move. This allowed it to snipe the Alakazam, Starmie, Jinx, and Chansey that stood in its way. And what's more, it allowed it to do so without sacrificing itself with Explosion. Beam Gore, as it was sometimes affectionately referred to, became a tier staple. Other special attackers could fit the move to bypass these would-be counters with high special. This was most commonly seen on the Ice-type trio of Lapras, Articuno, and Cloyster, while Victreebel and Moltres ran it effectively as well. Even if their attack stats weren't amazing, Hyper Beam offered them something no other move could. Even Zapdos could sometimes slot the move in, and it had a difficult time giving up on either Agility or Thunder Wave. But being able to threaten Chansey and even more importantly, the otherwise hard counter Jolteon was enormous. On the rarest of occasions, even Starmie could fit the move to snipe Alakazam and Chansey. Hyper Beam offered a ton of creative applications, and other physical attackers could use the move too, of course. Dragonite's huge attack let it wield Hyper Beam as a powerful weapon to supplement its rap antics, while Kingler's seemingly beefy attack in conjunction with the rare Swords Dance gave it the title of strongest Hyper Beamer in the game after one turn of setup, letting it threaten to clean house late game. So overall, RBY Hyper Beam is one of the most unique moves in the game, and its skill-intensive nature is part of what makes RBY such a dynamic metagame. The rewards are of course huge, but you can't just spam the move for easy results. You will be punished for it. And so Hyper Beam, for good and ill, is an enormous definitive piece of what makes Gen 1 Gen 1. Generation 2 removed the mechanic where Hyper Beam doesn't recharge if it KOs something, and thus the move basically disappeared from the competitive scene. It was here that the general rule of don't use Hyper Beam if you want to win serious battles came into being. However, it was also here that some players found unique ways of bending this rule for a new style of high risk, high reward. The primary example came in the form of an alternate version of Belly Drum Charizard, which was itself already a high risk, high reward Pokemon. It was tough to set up safely, but it could potentially end games like nobody's business. Its biggest problem was that it didn't have any physical stab moves on its standard attacking set of Earthquake, Rock Slide, and Fire Blast, meaning it could sometimes come up short of power against healthy, bulky targets, most notably Snorlax. Thus, some players tried out Hyper Beam or Rock Slide using Pink Bow or Polka Dot Bow, Generation 2's equivalent of Silk Scarf, as the item to give it the extra boost. This allowed Charizard, once boosted to Gen 2's maximum of 999 attack, to pack a 92.3% chance of one-hit KOing a full health Snorlax with Hyper Beam. It was so strong it could even one-hit KO Suicune. It had a 30.8% chance to take it out cleanly from full health and did 89% minimum, meaning that something as simple as spike support would get the job done. Players considered Hyper Beam a pseudo-explosion, since they were effectively sacrificing Charizard the next turn. Plus, Gen 2 didn't have such insane levels of speed and setup power that the free turn Zard would give away would be too much of a hindrance, most of the time anyway. Using Hyper Beam fundamentally changed the way Belizard played. Whereas the standard set attempted to sweep late game, this variant was more of a mid-game wall breaker that lured and destroyed the would-be answers to the standard set, such as Snorlax, Suicune, and Vaporeon. Of course, this set was gimmicky to say the least, and it was immensely difficult to fit as a result, but there was legitimacy to it, and by far the best application of Hyper Beam in the second generation. The third generation had a whopping 2 different styles of Hyper Beam. The most immediately apparent was on Slaking, which was itself gimmicky, but nobody would question its use of Hyper Beam. All Slaking needed was spammable normal stab, Earthquake, and Shadow Ball, and seeing as it was such a high risk, high reward Pokemon already, they may as well slap Hyper Beam on it for a devastating final attack. Its power was utterly breathtaking. In addition to crushing even the bulkiest neutral targets like Suicune, Celebi, and Swampert, it also ripped well over half HP from bulky resists like Tyranitar, Metagross, and Jirachi. Plus, one would already be ready for whatever increasingly powerful setup sweeper that would try to take advantage of the free turn Slaking would afford the opponent. They had to be, since that came with the territory of its pesky Truant ability. This was of course rare, as Slaking is famously flawed after all. And the other use of Hyper Beam was a la GSC Drumzard, another attempt by a physical sweeper to bust past a physical wall. Swampert was public enemy number 1 for Dragon Dance Tyranitar, the most dangerous sweeper in the tier, and so some players attempted to give Tyranitar a pseudo explosion by equipping it with a Silk Scarf Hyper Beam. The damage it dished out was enormous. It dealt a whopping 66 to 77 to max defense pert, and most pert did not run max defense, so it really got hammered. Hyper Beam wasn't just an anti-pert move either. It was also excellent for letting a +1 Tyranitar pass other would-be checks like bulky Flygon, which would take 69 to 81% even if it ran absolute max defense, as it rarely did, as well as Claydol and Suicune. Tyranitar wouldn't be able to sweep itself, of course, but by utilizing Hyper Beam's widely encompassing neutral coverage and sheer power, it was able to remove these tough-to-break walls for the benefit of its dangerous cleanup teammates like Dragon Dance Salamence or Choice Band Aerodactyl. Of course, this was as rare as it was gimmicky, but it did have some degree of legitimacy. Some players even tried the same tactic on Salamence and Dragonite, though they were more of a hindrance by the choice between Leftovers and Silk Scarf, since they were affected by the ever-present Sandstorm. If someone saw a DD Ments without Leftovers, for example, they might think something was up, but the extra power from Silk Scarf was really nice. Generation 3 had one more user of Hyper Beam, though it wasn't exactly Hyper Beam. It was one of the Hyper Beam clones introduced. Fire Red and Leaf Green blessed Venusaur, Charizard, and Blastoise with Frenzy Plant, Blast Burn, and Hydro Cannon respectively, and Charizard was able to use this competitively as a variation on its Sunny Day set. By subbing down to low HP, it would activate both its Blaze and a +1 special attack boost from Pataya Berry. Along the way, it would also set up Sunny Day, making it unbelievably powerful, doing monstrous things like one-hit KOing Salamence with Fire Blast. However, a few classic anti-fire type Pokemon still got in its way: Blissey, Milotic, and Suicune. Every Pokemon had its counters, of course, and this didn't stop Sunny Zard from being a great Pokemon, but some players decided to slap Blast Burn on it, and its sheer power would, with the slightest chip and or favorable damage rolls, destroy even those walls. There was nothing like one-hit killing Blissey with a special attack, and Blast Burn Charizard is definitely one of the coolest Pokemon of all time, and deserves to be included alongside the Hyper Beamers. Generation 4 brought about the physical special split that finally transformed Hyper Beam into a physical attack. But not to worry, it also brought with it a new normal type physical counterpart: Giga Impact. Nothing really used Giga Impact though. Maybe a rogue Choice Band Staraptor or two, but Hyper Beam actually received quite a bit of attention at the beginning of the generation thanks to a new Pokemon called Porygon Z. With enormous base 135 special attack, incredible power boosting options between Choice Specs, Life Orb, Nasty Plot, the choice between 2 amazing abilities in Adaptability and Download, and of course Stab on Hyper Beam, players gawked at the sheer damage it could dish out. It even was able to achieve the famed one-hit KO on Blissey with a special attack after only 1 turn of setup. With Nasty Plot, Life Orb, and Adaptability, its Hyper Beam would easily, cleanly one-hit KO standard max HP Bold Blissey, doing an astonishing minimum of 103%. Even Calm Blissey was taken out from full health more often than not. Of course, as impressive as this did nothing to change the fact that Porygon Z was an intensely flawed Pokemon who did not see much serious use at all as a result. Its defensive profile was approximately nil, meaning that actually successfully pulling off a Nasty Plot was monstrously difficult, and even if it didn't go the setup route, special normal type offense wasn't the way to go in a metagame of Steels, Ghost types, and newly special defense boosted Tyranitar. Porygon Z was a classic case of the Rampardos theorem. Still, its power remained the stuff of legends. And we're skipping Gens 5 and 6 because neither Hyper Beam nor any of its variants had any sort of gimmick in those. Nothing worth mentioning anyway. Sure, Blast Burn Mega Charizard Y probably did something hilarious like once, like being so strong that it managed to bypass Heatran's Flash Fire, because that's realistic and cool, but really nothing notable. However, Generation 7's Z moves were the potential Juggernaut Hyper Beam and its variants needed to see use again by strengthening them into obscenely powerful nukes free of the recharging drawback. And indeed, this is exactly what happened. For the first time since RBY, a Hyper Beam variant was not just used, but was a prominent tier staple. Not once either, but twice. The first example came in the form of one of Kartana's most common dangerous sets, which utilized Normalium Z to power up an already strong Giga Impact into an utterly monstrous 200 base power Breakneck Blitz, which crushed several common would-be answers, namely Tornadus Therian and Zapdos, while also providing massive power against the Mega Lati twins, or even letting it win a one-off against Mega Charizard Y. It was a huge part of what made Kartana so devastating. Eventually, it even became the standard Z crystal of choice on its Swords Dance set. And it wasn't the only Z Giga Impact Swords Dancer in the tier either. The second example came in the form of Sandrush Excadrill, another outstanding user of the strategy. Breakneck Blitz, especially boosted, was most useful for letting Excadrill blast through an otherwise excellent counter and Rotom Wash, while its enormous power and coverage maintained a tremendous nuke options against other popular answers like Landorus, Therian, and Tangrowth. At long last, Hyper Beam, or at least its physical counterpart, was a genuine force in OU again, in some form. What about Hyper Beam itself though? Did it ever receive the Breakneck Blitz treatment? Well, technically yes, Superior could use it to somewhat decent effect, boosting with Leaf Storm and utilizing the excellence of Normal's widespread neutral coverage to blast past Pokemon it would seriously struggle with otherwise, most notably Amoonguss, while also maintaining a strong smack on fire and dragon types, and of course having a huge move to smack its #1 nemesis, Tornadus Therian. However, it was on the rarer side, whereas Kartana and Excadrill were standards. Generation 8 of course removed Z moves, and thus these strategies disappeared. But there were sparing appearances of Hyper Beam and friends again, although it was really sparing, as in they technically existed. Some players brought back Swords Dance Giga Impact Kartana, and they were willing to take the recharge turn in order to destroy the same Pokemon that had returned to check it once more. Others experimented with a similar Zapdos destroying set in Hyper Beam Tornadus Therian, which could now boost itself with Nasty Plot. Again, incredibly rare and niche, but they have been used. And that's it! Many of us consider Hyper Beam to be a Generation 1 exclusive and one of the unique tools that no other generation possesses. And that's true, since of course no other gen has that famous incredible mechanic where the move doesn't recharge upon picking up a KO. And honestly, that's definitely for the best, especially as power creep increased over the generations. Can you imagine how much more insanely difficult to handle so many Pokemon would be if Gen 1 Hyper Beam mechanics still existed? Anyway, though Hyper Beam's status as the most nerfed move in history leads us to expect it to be non-existent post RBY, that's just not true. It's of course incredibly rare, but it and its counterparts have had its uses. That said, we still don't recommend using Hyper Beam if you're playing Ubers and staring down at Mewtwo, unless of course the Ubers tier you're playing is that of the first generation. Thanks for watching everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and please let us know what you think about these new type of videos. We would like to produce more of these because they're really fun and refreshing to make. So whatever your opinion is on the video, or if there's another topic you'd like to see us cover, please let us know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to all of you watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms, and that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.